Game number 1, Deplete from Beyond, and the boys starting up right now in Shrine. Let's get it.
Alright, so we already see a slight difference in comp. We see the DK coming in by Deplete from Beyond, while the boys is running a Demon Hunter with the 2 Hunters. Now, it is Bolstering, so usually we don't see DKs that often. And it looks like Deplete from Beyond, they didn't do the skip properly. Doesn't look like they wanted to pull those initiates here.
Usually you don't want to pull those initiates. That's definitely weird. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen any team pull those initiates, so yeah, definitely a misplay on the skip right away, but it looks like they're gonna go ahead and they're just CCing mobs randomly now. This is not going well for them at all. Dr. J already dead, and they're not able to go into their normal skip rotation where you see what people normally do. They jump down into that brazier, they cleave everything down, and then they sort of start cutting up the stairs. We're seeing that from the boys. Deplete from Beyond, this is not how you want to start your dungeon off at all.
No, definitely not. And you see, it looks like some of these casters are already bolstered. And with the double hunter comp, you definitely have a higher cooldown on your interrupt with a double range. Demon Shia going down actually, and the boys side as well. They don't have a battle rest class, so need to use an engineer rest if they want to get him back up. Because remember, they skipped the initiates at the start, both of the teams, so they can't release and come back. And now Petco going down as well. There was very highly bolstered casters here. Rest going down. This needs to be a complete reset. And what a disaster already from at the beginning of this dungeon here.
I feel like I might have underplayed how difficult bolstering explosive is, just in general, not to mention how difficult it is in this dungeon. I mean, going for that big snap pull onto the brazier at the bottom of the stairs is already difficult in of itself, but the way teams are able to deal with that is by running that double DK comp that we're used to seeing in this dungeon. So they melt the trash pack before they have to worry about any extra cast or interrupts getting off, and they weren't able to do that with their comp, and they also had to make sure they weren't just, you know, single target nuking one of the mobs down because of the bolstering affix. We're seeing Deplete from Beyond now go for that pull. It should be a little easier for them to start whittling things down with the DK damage. As you can see, it's doing almost triple the 2.5 times the damage of the hunters, but they have to be careful with the bolstering at the end here. There's definitely one of those attendants is a little bit higher than everything else. They got a single target focus that down, but it looks like they're doing a much better job here.
Yeah, so the boys had to release and had to actually deal with those initiates, and now they're looks like they're dealing with the Templar as well, maybe dragging it into the next pack here on top of the casters. And these mobs are actually very dangerous to deal with just because there's so many important casts that need to be interrupted. There's heals, there's shields, there's a Riptide, and then there's Water Blast, which doesn't necessarily need to be interrupted, but it does a lot of damage to your tank, and if they all go through, then they're just going to have a hard time surviving it, especially at the very end of the pull when they're all bolstered. Deplete from Beyond, though, did manage to finish up that trash pack up to 12% trash now, and dealing with that Void Weaver. Looks like they want to drag it to the first boss.
Yep, it looks like that's exactly what they're doing with Rentari running and snapping Void Weaver mouth there on top of the brazier. Like we talked about yesterday, these awakened mobs, they live to be snapped. If you trip over a pebble, they'll snap to you. So we're seeing tanks abuse that to the fullest extent whenever they possibly can, because whenever you go for these skips, the major time waster is just waiting for the awakened mobs to, you know, slowly walk to where you want them to go. So if you're able to get them to, you know, jump 40-50 yards with a snap pull, that's always a time save for these teams. Rentari now grabbing these 2 mobs and I'm going to be pulling them into the Shrine Templar pack here, and they're going to be AoEing this down with that Unholy DK. I don't think this should be too big of a problem with bolstering. Of course, those neutral mobs don't bolster the enemy mobs in any dungeon in BFA, so they don't have to worry about that, but just a little bit of an extra AoE engine for the DK here.
Yeah, and the boys, I mean, they're definitely behind, but they're actually dealing with more trash here at the beginning compared to Deplete from Beyond, who only did, I believe, 13% trash at the start. And the boys, they're already up to 16%. Once they finish this off, they're going to be very close to the percentage that Deplete from Beyond already has. So already a different route from both of those teams. This means the boys can skip something later on that Deplete from Beyond probably has to play.
Yeah. I mean, looking at the dungeons that they have to play on this series is kind of daunting. Like we were talking about precast, every single dungeon has either bolstering or explosive, and of course, they've got both in this dungeon. So they've got to be great with their bolstering management and their explosive management. Of course, hunters are great for dealing with those explosives, but you can kind of get overrun by them. We've seen a lot of wipes to explosives this weekend alone. So the amount of actual like mob control in this particular series is going to be incredibly important. And, you know, what better a prize for that than guaranteeing yourself a top 4 place in the European region and moving on to the finals. Of course, whoever wins this will get that. So, yeah, you want to see them really fighting for it here.
Yeah, and I mean, the amount of pressure on those teams as well, because of the very reason you just mentioned, right? And then you start a shrine that has never been played before on this tournament with these affixes, and you, from the get-go, already have a wipe/mistake at the very start. This must be so nerve-wracking for both of these teams. They can watch the stream, but it's a little bit on a delay, and they might have noticed that the other team also has problems, but still, it's just going to be so nerve-wracking for them and so stressful for them to keep the head in the game and just focus on their own play after already having an initial mistake. And the boys already up to those 5 deaths, right? Deplete from Beyond only 1 death, but still cost them quite a bit of time to mispull those initiates at the very start.
Yeah, and you gotta wonder how Deplete from Beyond feels about the situation too, right? Because they were 1 game away from solidifying their position in that top 4 bracket that we were talking about. If they won their match against Method EU yesterday, which they were 1-0 up in the series against, they would have then, you know, solidified their position in the top 4. I feel like if they were to have that guaranteed top 4 position slip away after potentially losing this series, that would be a heartbreaker for them.
Yep, definitely. We don't see either of the teams pull the mini boss Heldis on top of this boss, which we've seen some teams do in the past, but it is fortified, so Heldis does do more damage, and it's bolstering. Now, theoretically, I think we saw teams already in the past with bolstering pull Heldis on top anyway, and just leave her alive for the whole fight, because she does give you the zone, the buff, but she constantly does an AoE damage on the whole group once in a while, so it looks like both of those teams just chose to not deal with that at all, and they play from Beyond immediately going into the obelisk here, interestingly enough.
Yeah, that is interesting, because it is the breaker of heroes, which normally isn't something that we see teams that are running hunters worry about too much. Of course, the hunters can always opt to pet taunt that spirit breaker cast on the tank, so that the tank doesn't have to really worry about the damage intake. Now, the reasoning might be that they just want to skip as much as possible of this section of the dungeon, because this is the section of the dungeon that has those mini bosses that have a lot of HP, which is incredibly difficult to deal with for bolstering. Doesn't look like they're going to skip all the way through though. They're going to be killing it at the end of the hallway here, so they're not going to be skipping, well, really anything, looks like.
Interesting. So there's like a patrol, an initiative patrol that has a lot less HP than anything else. Looks like they're just going out here, dealing with the initiates, waiting for the, yeah, there we go. So they're dealing with the initiates, and maybe then they're pulling the rest of the trash together just to avoid the bolstering from it, which, I mean, it seems like an interesting strat, but they didn't necessarily need to do it with the portal, right? They could have just had double hunter trap on the first mobs and then pulled the initiates out. So yeah, not really sure why they chose to do it this way, but the boys, on the other hand, they're already all the way through. They shut them out off a bunch of trash here, and they're pulling the Guardian from the bridge.
I didn't see it because we were busy looking at what was Deplete from Beyond was doing, but we saw an interesting strategy earlier in these cups. I think it was 2 weeks ago. We saw one of the tanks, I want to say it was maybe Method EU, going in and spell reflecting the Guardian, but hold on for a second. As Bob goes down in this trash pull, they have to get the battle res off here. It looks like the cast is going off, but that stun circle is going to block the res. They do end up somehow getting it off. They were able to stun it off, but this is just, they have to catch up here. Res is dropping incredibly low to this.
Yeah, this is a super scary pull because they're pulling this Guardian Elemental here, and it seems to be bolstering quite a bit as well, as it's still half HP, and all of the trash around it is dying. That means this Guardian Elemental is really highly bolstered at this point. And Bob dying again, they don't have any more battle reses. I'm not sure if they can finish this off without Bob, because this Guardian Elemental does a lot of AoE. They can line of sight it, but then they just won't be able to do enough damage. There we go, this is going to be a full reset on their side.
Naladra could feign dust this off, but that doesn't really make the situation any better,
No.
right? And also, he could just go down to bad explosive spawns here, so there could be some RNG, but it looks like he's going to be able to, wait.
It looks like he was feign deathing,
He's just
but
gonna die
didn't
to
get
it,
out of
yeah,
combat,
okay.
so he just, yeah.
He's going to die to it to make sure it resets and doesn't keep its bolstering stacks, it looks like. Yeah, I mean, that Shipbreaker Storm, that's like the Lantern Bears and Moss Holes. Does an absolutely massive amount of damage, even when it's not bolstered or buffed by anything else. It's not something you really ever want to deal with. And looks like the boys, after dealing with that wipe, are just going to go ahead and pull Void over Mouth here. Interesting choice.
So maybe they're just dragging her all the way down to that area because they were actually not dealing with any of the obelisks so far. While Deplete from Beyond had 2 obelisks dealt with already, the boys didn't do any of that. So maybe they... I mean, it also would have been really hard for them to do a skip all the way down there, right? Without the portals, without rogues. They do have shadow melts available, but it's still a really long skip from the entrance to all the way there to the bridge elemental. So maybe they just choose to do this Void Weaver to just get the portal. But yeah, this is a huge time loss for them. They're 11 deaths in, so 55 seconds on top of the counter, while Deplete from Beyond, I mean, they don't have any more problems after that initial mistake that they did. They're up to 42% trash, dealt with 2 obelisks already, and they're dealing with this trash pretty nicely here as well.
I mean, this is about the biggest trash pull you can pull off in this section of the dungeon, right? All of the mobs have similar amounts of HP, so you can just full cleave them down and not have to worry about any one mob having more HP than everything else. So that's what we're seeing them do here, letting the DK just pop off. The only other thing they have to worry about is there's a patrol of 2 of these apprentices somewhere in those initiates. You can see both of them are hunter trapped up there. So what they're probably going to do is pull all of the initiates, let them stack up, AoE them down, and then pull those 2 apprentices on their own. Hopefully we'll see Rentari go for that right here. Not even pulling all of them. There's still 2 packs up at the top that he could opt to pull, but don't want to let the bolstering get too out of hand.
Yeah, if you have that many targets, even if you only use your AoE abilities that are hitting everything equally, it's still super, super difficult to kill them all at the same time. And if you have that many targets, if you bolster a little bit at the very end, it's still a huge time loss. So I think I like the fact that they don't pull all at once. Let's see what they do now. Okay, so it looks like they're pulling the rest of the initiates with the double hunter MDing to the snapping spot here in the corner. So just dealing with initiates in 2 pulls. And yeah, they're just very annoying with bolstering.
It looked like one of them didn't get snapped. It looked like it was running in. Yeah, look there, it's running in now, so they're gonna have to single target focus that one down. If that gets bolstered up, it could have a lot of HP, but they're doing a really good job of bolstering it down. Of course, these initiates don't have that much HP, so one of them coming in late, as long as you actually have everyone swap your single target focus to it, you can see what just happened with them there. They were able to make sure they got all their single target focus damage off, but that could have been bad.
Yeah, definitely. And now we see Rentari. Do they want to... Oh, it looks like they actually want to kill the bridge elemental and Deplete from Beyond side as well. So both teams opting to kill this elemental. The boys now managed to finally get it down on their side after having this initial wipe. So they're now dealing with the trash in this area as well. While Deplete from Beyond... Interesting to see that they went past elemental first and then go back to killing it afterwards. Huh.
Yeah. Maybe it's just they need the 1 mob for the extra count to finish off their dungeon. You have to remember they also accidentally pulled some mobs at the start of the dungeon that they probably wouldn't have otherwise pulled, so they have a couple extra percent. But it looks like this is a practice thing. You saw Rentari going in first with everyone else standing out of line of sight just so we could spell reflect the first cast of the Guardian Elemental. Just a little bit of an extra damage boost for them there. And they'll probably move on to just... they don't really have to deal with these 2 apprentices. They can just go through and go to the boss and keep those CC'd.
Oh no, it fell off.
It wouldn't surprise me to see them pull them maybe with some of this trash past the boss. Let's see what they do.
Interesting.
What's going on here?
Yeah, that one's really highly bolstered. Okay, so he was just feign deathing it because they were in combat with this pack and they were... Now, the thing with Trap is that it's actually not a true CC. The only true CCs in the game are Sap from the Rogue and Imprison from a Demon Hunter. So if you use those CCs, then the mobs are actually not going to be in combat with you. But if you use Trap or Incap or any of those other CCs, then it's not a true CC and they're still going to be in combat with you if you're too close to them. And what you can do usually is just have one person get in combat, like a Hunter for example, and then they can feign death off the aggro afterwards, and the rest of the team is not going to be in combat with it. But this is why they bolstered, because it was not a true CC, bolstered all the way up from all of those initiates dying, and then whichever hunter was in combat with it had to feign death, and it looked like the rest of the team was in combat with it too, so they had to all shadow melt off the aggro there.
Yeah, that was, I mean, not ideal, and you can see, because of how slowly they ended up dealing with this section of the dungeon, it's given the boys time to sort of catch up in dungeon progression, even after their 2 full team wipes. So even though they do have all those extra deaths on the board, they're going to be pulling this boss relatively soon after Deplete from Beyond has. They still do have that extra minute or so in death timer to make up, and of course, you know, they are half of the percentage of the boss's HP behind, but they're slowly whittling their way back into this dungeon, and Deplete from Beyond has to be careful to not go too slowly here, because they're kind of letting the boys back into it.
Yeah, I mean, they're now engaging the boss as well. Neither of the teams actually using their Bloodlust, which, that's interesting because, I mean, they still have 40% trash left, and there's still 2 bosses, so I feel like they might get another one if they would use it here, just because of the initial problems that they had, making it a little bit slower than in practice. So maybe if they would have used Bloodlust on cooldown, it would have gotten up again at the very end, but they probably just want to make sure it is up. Because if they have to deal with the awakened mobs in the last boss, they definitely want the blast. There's so many explosives spawning, unfortunately for the boys. Red's going down. They do have a battle rest, but they need to use an engineering rest. Looks like they're in combat with their apprentices here. Yeah, they have to reset the boss and do this again. This huge mistake by the boys again. Not really sure what exactly happened, but they're in combat with an apprentice here on the side. You see the hunter pets actually attacking one of these apprentices, and looked like the boss actually got bolstered somehow.
Yeah, I missed what the start of that pull was.
Yeah.
I don't know if they pulled that one mob in on purpose, which could make sense because it would activate rapid reload for the hunters, just give them a little bit of extra damage for the boss. But that's just, I mean, adding unnecessary danger into an already like difficult set of dungeon affixes. Like we just saw there, explosive can get out of hand quickly, even if you only have 3 mobs pulled. You have to be careful. I mean, yeah, that's not the way you want to see a wipe go down. And just like we were talking about, they were making their way back into this dungeon, but that's going to be a deal breaker there. Now, the thing is, the dungeon isn't over yet. Yes, they're 15 deaths behind. Yes, they're an entire boss behind. But we've seen just how difficult this final boss can be in this Awakened Affix. A lot can go wrong quickly, and 1 or 2 team wipes to that final boss could let the boys back into it. But Deplete from Beyond has to be aware of where they are in the dungeon, how far ahead they are in the dungeon. They've already dealt with 2 of the Awakened mobs. You know what? I really wouldn't be surprised to see them deal with the 3rd one here.
Yeah, I mean, even if, because they're in a little bit of a delay, right? So maybe they don't know yet that the boys wiped. But once they do realize they wiped, if I were them, I probably would deal with the obelisk, like you mentioned, because it just makes the last boss a lot easier. On top of, I mean, we've already mentioned that explosive is a pretty big deal on the last boss. So if you have to deal with the obelisk as well, it makes it just so much more difficult. Especially because you need a lot of damage to deal with those awakened mobs, because you kind of need to kill most of them before you go into the intermission phase. I mean, you don't have to, but it makes it so much easier if you don't have to deal with the awakened mobs in the split phase. Now it looks like we see a double pull here on the bridge for Deplete from Beyond. This is a pretty dangerous pull because these mobs, they're not very easy to deal with, but we have very, very even damage from Deplete from Beyond, looks like.
Yep, I mean, there's a lot of individual single target damage abilities that go out in the group, and there's one of those cultists that is actually pretty high, 30% HP.
True.
And if that gets bolstered anymore, it's going to be a lot of HP they have to chew through. In this Fortified Affix, that cultist, even though it's at 20% HP, it could have, 1.52 million HP left. So you do not want to bolster it any more than you already have, and you can see they're making sure they don't want to kill either of those other 2 mobs before they get that cultist lower. That could have been a terrible situation for Deplete from Beyond, but they're able to just barely make sure they get through that without any major issues.
Yeah, now they're up to those Dweller packs, and they can be very dangerous because it's 45 to do a lot more damage, and these lash casts, if they are not interrupted by AoE stuns, can be very unlucky. All going in one. You see Click's actually dropping really low. Did manage to recover using his acceleration here to heal himself up a bit. And now they've got to be careful in the second one, because if they're out of defensives now or AoE stun, oh, there we go, Shockwave coming in by Rentari, and they should be fine to finish this one off.
Yep, no major issues for them on any of this trash. Of course, those aren't going to be too major of an issue for them. And now they're at the trash percentage they have left to move into the final section of the dungeon here as they engage Lord Stormsong. This is one of those bosses that we were talking about yesterday, where your warrior tank can actually do a lot of damage by spell reflecting that main ability of Lord Stormsong. Kind of wish we had that enabled on our damage meters, but I don't think we currently do. Yeah, he just didn't get any of the void bolt damage there. But that's okay. They'll chew through this boss pretty quickly on this Fortified Affix.
Yep, and looks like they're all using their defensives here to immune the Ancient Mindbender, which is the mind control, and they did it successfully too. They do have double turtle and AMS, So the only person who can't immune it is Igloo on that Mistweaver, because tanks, of course, cannot be affected by that mind control. And they got it on one of the immune people, therefore the ability just does not get recast, and they just completely got rid of it. So good on them for using that immunity here. And look at the amount of damage they have as well. The boss is just dropping so incredibly fast, even though they don't have Bloodlust or the army by Curry. They just still did a lot of damage, and it's dropping really quickly. Maybe they can even... Oh no, never mind. There's a second mind control on Igloo. That is lucky as well, just on their healer this time. So not a damage dealer that got that second one.
Yep, and the balls are gone, so he's just going to take a little dip in the pool and finish off that orb. Of course, that is kind of the more efficient way of dealing with that mind control mechanic. You want to dip into that pool, and you actually want to go underwater a little bit. Just sitting on the surface of the pool won't do any damage to you. So that's what we see a lot of teams will opt to do. Like the first mind control will go in the pool, and they'll slowly whittle themselves down that way, and then the second mind control will have access to literally every single orb that's spawned in the fight and should be able to break themselves relatively instantly. Good execution from Deplete from Beyond there, and we're into the most difficult section of the dungeon here. This is incredibly difficult execution-wise. We could see a lot go wrong here, and this will kind of speak to how well Deplete from Beyond is prepared for this dungeon, because there's nothing nice about how this final boss works with these affixes.
Yeah, and one thing to note as well is that these eels are going to be pretty dangerous for them as well. It is fortified. They're not actually bolstering as far as I'm aware, right? They don't get affected by undeath affixes. So bolstering not going to affect those eels, thankfully. Otherwise, those packs would be very, very dangerous. But they should be still spawning explosives, so can still be dangerous as well. We see 2 packs being pulled by Deplete from Beyond here. We'll see if they actually pull it on top of the boss. And yeah, it looks like Rentari is going close to the boss, and they will engage with that Bloodlust, and they just want to nuke their Awaken mobs down as fast as they can once they spawn.
And it's important to mention, I don't think the single target DPS check here on Volzith is going to be that big of a deal. I'd be very surprised if we don't see them just single target focus down the Awaken mobs as much as possible. Of course, a Fortified boss has about the exact same amount of HP as a Tyrannical boss with about 70% of its HP left, so they really don't have to do too much damage to Volzith. If they get it to 75, 70%, they should be able to single target focus it down later on, no issues, even without the Bloodlust. And you can see, yeah, they're trying to kill that Beckoner of Chaos off as quickly as possible, and with him down, that makes this intermission phase so much more easily. We'll more than likely see Rentari kite out this Blood of the Corruptor until the Forgotten Denizens are dealt with from the DPS players, and then they'll sort of whittle down that Blood of the Corruptor before they end up engaging the boss. I mean, so far, this is going flawlessly for Deplete from Beyond.
Yeah, looking pretty good. The blood is also pretty low as well. Now, the blood actually does do quite a bit of melee damage to the tank, so he needs to be a little bit careful, because he's also dealing with the Denizen as well, which also does a lot of tank damage. So Rentari definitely kiting as much as he can and trying to mitigate as much damage as he can now that he's out of defensives. No more Last Stand or Shield Wall available for him. But yeah, as long as they deal with that intermission phase properly, they do have 2 hunters, which means they have a little bit of a longer interrupt compared to a full melee comp. That means they have to let 1 cast go through on that ranged Denizen. But since Igloo is in a different phase, he will not get the damage from the cast going through, and therefore he is totally fine. And once Igloo is back, they just need to make sure they interrupt everything. So now they're waiting for, I assume, cooldowns to come back up before they engage the boss again.
Yep, definitely just waiting on cooldowns here. They're not in any hurry. They know they're ahead in the dungeon by a pretty significant amount, and they've now opted to just go for the Denizens. Now, of course, they can outrange the boss for bolstering range by just moving them to the other end of the platform. So they don't really have to worry about that too much. As long as they get a little bit closer to the edge of the platform, they'll be fine. And this is just something that they can do extra while they wait for their cooldowns to reset. There is an explosive spawning on the boss, so one of the hunters is going to have to pop over and hit that. You can see clicks at the right of your screen taking care of that. Looks like they're doing a pretty good job of dealing with the mechanics. That Sunken Denizen, however, is going to be pretty bolstered here.
Yeah, gotta be a bit careful here with Rentari so he doesn't go down. Now, one thing to note about that buff that or debuff that Igloo has, it increases his damage done, but it also decreases his max HP. Now, most affixes actually do percentage health damage, so that is why Igloo, like even if an explosive goes off, Igloo is not gonna get straight up one shot. It's just gonna do percentage damage, so it's gonna do much less damage to Igloo than it does to the rest of the people, because he's of course got a lot less HP than everyone else because of the debuff.
And the cooldowns are just about coming up for every player in the group, so they're going to gather up their second set of eels, pull them into the boss, let the DK stack up his Festermite stacks, get that strength buff, and a 70% HP fortified boss. They should be able to cleave through. Now, the thing to look out for are random explosive spawns during this boss. The hunters are going to have to stay on top of that because they could end up taking a lot of damage on the group there, but you're going to see this boss's HP start to melt here.
Yep, looks like they're ramping up their damage here. The eels should be going down any second now, and Rentari is using all of his defensives that he's got left. All defensives running right now, so he should be fine as well. And Igloo also going in melee, doing as much damage as he can with that damage amplifier. And you see the energy bar filling up below the HP here on Bolstering, but they have way more than enough damage to get him down before that next phase starts, it looks like. And they're already on 100% trash as well, so once this boss goes down, it's gonna be their game. So 1-0 for Deplete from Beyond in this very important lower match here.
That's right, we are going to see Deplete from Beyond take the win, and unfortunately the boys just kind of continue to be their own worst enemy throughout this lower bracket here, Tettles.
I mean, I think both teams didn't look stellar, but I think that's also a byproduct of how challenging these affixes are for both sides. I don't think I can... I don't know if I can just be super critical of the boys' play here because of how hard these affixes are. Like, Deplete from Beyond ran a live route, and the boys were playing something that was a little bit more aggressive, but they got incredibly punished for it. So, I don't know. You just kind of have to pick your battles, right?
Yeah, I suppose, but I think that's one of the things that, I mean, they had the option to ban it, right? They had the choice ahead of them as to what they did and did not want to ban, and right there from the beginning, Zyro, it just seemed like neither team was super well prepared for this.
Yeah, but you even had Now in chat earlier, like right before the match started, goes, Shrine went unbanned, Omega lol.
That's what I'm saying.
Like, okay.
It actually,
Yeah.
it's really weird to be honest, specifically because they banned Matherload, right? And Matherload, both of them were really close.
They had a 20-second.
Yeah, and I think it was even Deplete from Beyond who banned it, which had the faster time. Huh. Very interesting.
So...
That is, I mean, maybe I could see Motherload being a potential ban. We talked about it a little bit yesterday. The way that teams tend to pull that first section of the dungeon is pretty volatile. Like, if you have any Peacekeepers casting their shields at the wrong time and just healing to full, you could lose up to 30 seconds of time just based off of that alone. Yeah. So maybe they're not confident enough in their strategy in order to keep that dungeon in the pool. Of course, time trials, yeah, you get five actual attempts, but a lot of practice time. Maybe they didn't feel confident that their strategy was consistent enough to play that in tournament play.
Maybe, yeah.
I mean, yeah, you probably could feel like you're coin flipping that dungeon on Sanguine because, like, dude, you full heal one Peacekeeper, you could just auto lose a dungeon off of healing a Peacekeeper, right?
Yeah. Wait, was it Deplete from Beyond that messed up the first pull of Motherload two weeks ago and just kind of?
Yes, that was
it.
Beyond.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That makes more sense now then. That's why they banned Motherload. All right.
There you go.
Let's go with that.
That's right. Let's also go with some of those highlights. Let's start with the highlights, lowlights today.
Yeah, so first and foremost, we had the boys wiping to, like, the second pull of the dungeon, or maybe the first pull of the dungeon that they even did. It was just mismanagement of bolstering. It's hard to be able to get stuff like the Templar, the Spiritualists, and the Attendants to all die within seconds of one another because the Templar is casting that protective aura, so you have to make sure that you continuously get kicks. They also don't have... I mean, sure, they have some purges in, like, the Hunters and the Demon Hunter, but it's kind of hard to be able to deal with as a whole. They mismanage bolstering, they end up wiping. Deplete from Beyond, on the other hand, is taking, again, like a more live route approach, where they're just kind of slowly pulling just piece by piece. The boys then get a little bit more aggressive, just more aggressive than Deplete from Beyond's route. They play the Guardian Elemental with the 4-pack. I mean, if they're able to pull that off, that's a sick pull. But instead what they get is a 4-stack Bolster Guardian Elemental that's going to wipe them immediately, which it did.
Yeah.
And then at that point, it's kind of Deplete from Beyond trying to make sure that they're able to manage explosives on the final boss. They did well enough. Like, the boss died really quickly because, like Zyronic was saying during the cast, it's a 19 fortified. You don't really have a ton of time. Like, as long as you're not going to get a second phase, you can just let those ads live. It doesn't really matter too much. If you're going to get a second phase and you have to do the intermission again, and all of the ads are still alive, they're going to still spawn explosives even while you're in the downstairs realm, and that's bad. So.
Yeah, it just seemed like there was way too many variables in an already tough dungeon that we were experiencing on this one. And it also is going to move us on into Waycrest, which is also not going to be too easy, Nagura. We got Fort Explosive. Grievous.
Yep, definitely not an easy dungeon at all. I think Grievous is already a pretty difficult affix. Oh wait, it's not Grievous, right? It's Teeming Bolstering, right? Or?
Oh, I have the wrong chart pulled up. You're right. Yep, I have the wrong chart pulled up.
Yep,
Yeah,
that's
boys.
it. Teeming Bolstering.
Okay. So,
That's the one.
That's right.
so Teeming Bolstering definitely makes
like,
that
surely
dungeon
this
more
isn't-
difficult. There's a bunch of mobs that don't get affected by Bolstering in Waycrest.
Yup.
Thankfully, they changed that throughout the expansion. So, but yeah, there's still a lot of mobs specifically because Teeming adds even more mobs, and then you're just gonna be very, very careful about that Bolstering. We saw what happens if you don't deal with that properly. Very, very careful about that Bolstering. We saw what happens if you don't deal with that properly. I think it was Paint for a Femme who did a really huge courtyard pull, and then they didn't interrupt the heals on the Thorn Guards, and then they were had like 10 stacks Bolstering and had soul fetishes, and it was just a full team wipe. So definitely very volatile in that dungeon.
Deplete from Beyond is also the team that plays those soul essences for 3% count at the very beginning of the dungeon,
True.
which we're always super critical of.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think Bolstering, like you were saying, is pretty rough for this dungeon, because if you get one heal off, you just kind of just have to forfeit the dungeon, because you have...
Or just feign death.
Yeah.
At the same time, this is a dungeon that we know Deplete from Beyond is good at. They had a super clean run in this map pool against Perplexed a couple weeks ago, and I mean, they even had a good run earlier in this tournament as well. And another clean run, only one death. So, like, these guys have this very, very, very solid Waycrest Manor, and I don't know.
And already pulling the boss.
Stole the line right from my mouth. Deplete from Beyond, also, yeah, once again, going for those soul essences. So, yeah, that's just their strategy in this dungeon, as weird as it may be.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can think of why they're doing it is because they literally just need that amount of trash and they couldn't find it anywhere else. And, I mean, if it makes another pull easier or they don't have to do a pull that is super risky, then why not? But yeah, both teams are on the first boss now. Popping Bloodless as well, which makes sense. It's Tyrannical. Just getting rid of that Bloodless cooldown immediately makes a lot of sense. And yeah, the boys 0% trash because they skipped those soul essences at the start. Deplete from Beyond up to 3% because of that interesting pull with the soul essences.
Yeah, that's. I mean, it's still a huge question mark to me. But let's be honest: if they're able to take a game off of Method U with a clean run, there's got to be, like, listen, I don't know. I don't. There's no way that's a better strategy, right? Like, there's got to be some better way of pulling 3% trash into some pull later in the dungeon. But once again, I think I've said this last time at Waycrest Manor. I'm a caster. My opinion doesn't matter. But you can see they're 1/6 of the boss behind because of that 3% pull that they brought in.
Yeah, I mean, it's also Teeming, right? Teeming is one of the affixes that's actually pretty... I mean, I wouldn't say hard to deal with, but it makes it changes up your strategy a lot. Just because Teeming changes the amount of enemy forces or trash percentage that each mob gives, because there's more trash available in the dungeon. So if you had a strategy for a Waycrest, let's say last week, without Teeming, then all of a sudden you need to change it up because you need to pull more. And that is definitely an affix that makes the teams change up their strategy, and I kind of like to see it, because I really like to see teams really adapting and not just like copying someone else's team strategy and just doing the same thing, maybe slightly different. So I really like seeing new strategies come out from all of the teams here, and seeing how they deal with that teaming. Deplete from Beyond actually pulling this patrol here on top of the boss at the very end. Pretty efficient, getting a little bit more trash at the very end without actually bolstering the boss.
Well, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but the affixes in this dungeon are pretty difficult in terms of like actual time loss affixes. A fast Waycrest Manor with your typical affixes in the MDI puts you at about a 15 to 16 minute Waycrest Manor, and we saw a relatively clean one death run from Deplete from Beyond yesterday that was over 19 minutes, about 19 and a half minutes. 5 Tyrannical bosses plus not really being able to pull all of the courtyard or any of the major pulls you do because of bolstering really slows down the dungeon, makes it more of a like clean, methodical dungeon rather than just a balls to the wall, pull everything as fast as you can, cleave them on top of the bosses dungeon that we've seen in weeks past.
Yep, and the boys looks like they're dealing with a double Runeweaver pack here with a bunch of guards now, and it looks like they overlap all 3 of their binding shots. That's definitely not what you want to do. So maybe, I don't know, maybe like miscommunication, but yeah, you definitely don't, if you run 3 hunters, it's actually very important to communicate properly, because if you call, let's say you're communicating and your tank says, put a binding shot please, but he doesn't say a name, and then all 3 hunters just put it down, that is definitely really bad. If you have 3 different classes, you can call a binding shot and everyone knows immediately who is it going to be. But when you run 3 hunters, you definitely want to make sure you communicate properly who's using what and at what time. So slight miscommunication there by the boys, but let's hope it doesn't affect them further on in this dungeon.
Yeah, I think that's a great point you bring up. There are so many like little small intricacies that each of the teams has to deal with, communication being one of them, that we just kind of tend to gloss over because we're used to our top teams just not having any issues with that. And, you know, seeing all 3 of the binding shots come out at the same time, that does raise some questions about, you know, where their team synergies are right now over on the side of the boys. Maybe there's a little bit of tilt, maybe a little bit of miscommunication coming out from them after that first map loss, because, you know, we know how important this series is. If you win this series, you're into the finals later this year. It's a big deal. It's kind of out of your hands if you end up losing this series, and they're kind of on that hot seat right now. However, Deplete from Beyond has moved on to Soulbound Goliath, pulling off that matron skip perfectly, and just moving on to dealing with this Tyrannical Soulbound Goliath, which by himself is no joke in these affixes.
Yeah, definitely not. It is Tyrannical, so there's a lot of tank damage with that stacking buff on the boss, and then once they do need to drag it into the fire, there's a pretty huge amount of AoE damage as well. Now both of the teams actually did not want to deal with that mini boss in front of Goliath, so we saw hunters just pulling it to the side, using their turtle to survive, while the healer was pulling Goliath back to the team, and then they just feign death off the aggro from that mini boss, not having to deal with it, because mini bosses usually, I mean, specifically this mini boss is hard to deal with just because you have those hounds right next to it, and then all of a sudden you need to deal with Bolstering, and it just makes it a pretty slow mini boss to deal with.
Yeah, if they are going to be pulling any trash into it, it's going to be at the last moment when the boss is probably 15-20% HP, and then they'll start cleaving everything down. So we won't see that for a while for either team here. But, I mean, it's just going to be a little bit of a slow grind as these teams just slowly whittle through the boss's HP, and they kind of start to gear up for that trash pull that we'll see them cleave on top of the boss. Probably that corner pack in the courtyard with maybe one of the captain packs. Yep, Igloo going in to pull one of those guard captain packs right now. So they're going to cleave that on top of the boss. Seems like it's a little bit early, but they can just tend to focus more on the boss damage here.
Yeah, the strength of hunters is definitely that focus damage, but yeah, this is a pretty dangerous pull because of those, because of all the casts that need to be interrupted here, on top of the guards doing a huge amount of damage to the tank. Lots of frontal casts that need to be dealt with, but it looks like they're interrupting everything pretty cleanly. There's one cast going through an Igloo, but it is a disease and it can actually be dispelled by Mistweavers, so not too big of a deal. But Igloo actually dropping really low, not only getting those debuffs on him, but also having an Eye of Corruption here. I think it looks like a double eye as he's got a lot of debuffs.
You know, it's crazy to think about, but I feel like the most important cast to interrupt in this pull on this bolstering affix is probably effigy reconstruction, right? Because if one of those gets through and everything starts bolstering and you have a full HP Thornguard at like 6 bolstering stacks, you just have to, I mean, well, they can all reset aggro with Feign Death and Shadow Meld, so that could save them there, but if they don't have that available, you could be in for a world of hurt there. But no issues for Deplete from Beyond, and it looks like the boys are able to deal with the boss before any bolstering stacks get out too. See if they're able to clean up this trash back as well. And it looks like it's good execution for both teams, but Deplete from Beyond still just that little bit ahead right now. Probably a good 40-45 second lead for them as they're already moving on to this hallway section before all the gluttonous.
Ooh, they got a heal on one of the Thorn Guards. Look, the Thorn Guard is almost high HP, and he's got Soul Fetish as well, as he's got this blue glow around it. That means he's got the Soul Fetish, and it one-shot Reds. Oh my god, okay, so they definitely need to reset this. There's no way they want to deal with this Thorn Guard at this point. They just gotta Shadow Melt off the aggro and try again.
Did I do that?
You did that, yes. Thanks, Sarah.
It's still wreaking havoc. Okay, never mind, it's resetting now. I wonder what they're gonna do with that. Are they just gonna leave it, or are they gonna pull it into this pack? We'll have to see. But they're just going to move on to the hallway pull for now. Maybe they have some extra mob they can pull into a trash pack later on, but that's not exactly what you want to see. That's unfortunate.
definitely not what you want to see. But we see Deplete from Beyond. They don't have any of those issues as they're already moving on, dealing with some of these Steward Peasant packs, which they can be pretty hard to deal with just because there's a lot of different HP amounts on these trash mobs. There's a lot of different named mobs that have different kinds of HP. Now the maggots don't actually bolster, so you don't have to deal with that one, thankfully. But it's still hard to deal with these kind of trash groups. That's why we see in this RAL room, we see a lot of CCs come in usually. We see hunter traps being thrown out on either mobs that have more HP than the rest of them, or mobs that have less HP than the rest of them, to be sure that they can deal with the bolstering better. But this time around, not actually using any of that CC on the Deplete from Beyond side.
And this is a large pull coming out from Deplete from Beyond. 3 trash packs in all the gluttonous rooms. There's about 9 or 10 mobs in this group. They really need to make sure that their cleave is completely even here, because like we've mentioned overall for the past 2 dungeons, bolstering can get out of hand quickly. It looks like they're doing, as expected, a good job of making sure nothing is being ignored here and everything's dying relatively evenly. Of course, some of these revelers are alive here. They have a little bit more HP than everything else, but they're all below 10% HP at this point. It shouldn't be too major of an issue for them, and with the room cleared, they'll be able to move right on to all the gluttonous. Deplete from Beyond, I mean, they've really got their strats down in these dungeons.
Yeah, this definitely looks pretty clean by them. I mean, as we mentioned, the affixes make this dungeon a lot slower than what we usually see in Waycrest Manor. But this is pretty much the fastest you can go with the Bolstering and Teeming, because you can't pull anything on top of bosses. And that is what we usually see here, right? Usually we see almost all of this trash here being pulled on top of RAL, where you see the double DKs just AoEing everything down. But obviously there's no way you can do that with Bolstering, so this is really as fast as you can go, and they're doing a really good job executing this properly. The boys, on the other hand, they're not too far behind. They are 64% trash. They still need to deal with this trash back here, but they got a little bit more trash earlier on. So, I mean, you could almost say that if the Deplete from Beyond has to pull something later in the dungeon that will cost them more time than the boys had to use to get this trash earlier, maybe it's a slight advantage for the boys. But yeah, still slightly behind for them. And on top of that, they also have the 2 deaths.
Well, the major things to think about, right, are the trash difference, like you just mentioned. Deplete from Beyond is more than likely going to get that extra trash from pulling most or all of the dungeon after all the gluttonous. The boys do have to, however, think about where they're going to get that extra couple % trash from the Thorn Guard they left outside.
True.
That is something they're going to have to think about. So I'm interested to see what the difference in strategies here is going to be, but let's be honest, 70% of a Tyrannical boss's HP behind right now for the boys, that's a lot of HP to chew through. And yeah, all the gluttonous isn't a particularly dangerous boss, but he really is a big meat shield that you have to spend a lot of time dealing with.
I mean, there's one thing that we haven't looked at too much yet, and that's the obelisks, right? We've seen teams, I think Deplete from Beyond only plays 2 obelisks with the last boss, if I'm not mistaken. The boys we haven't seen at all yet. So if, for whatever reason, the boys decide to do 3 or even 4 obelisks with the last boss while Deplete from Beyond is dealing with them beforehand, that could be the one-time save or the time advantage that the boys need. Now, obviously, it is very, very dangerous to do the last boss with extra awakened mobs, because it's a Tyrannical fight and it's very, very limited space in that last boss area. But that would be the one thing they could maybe risk. Maybe they know, look, we're behind. Let's try it. Let's play 4 obelisks with the last boss.
Yeah, and of course they're going for this sort of Method EU-esque strat where they're pulling 2 awakened mobs at the same time and cleaving them down. They've got the Breaker of Heroes and the Beckoner of Chaos at the same time, so they'll be cleaving these 2 down. This seems like a pretty efficient way to deal with those obelisks, and like you mentioned, once they've dealt with these 2 obelisks, they're leaving the Void of Malthier and the Blood of the Corruptor for the final boss, and usually just having 2 awakened mobs shouldn't be too major of an issue for these teams. Of course, you've seen how Deplete from Beyond deals with it, and they do a pretty good job of it.
Yeah, definitely. And you also have the hunters, which make it slightly easier to deal with, at least with the Spirit Breaker. Oh, but they're actually dealing with the Spirit Breaker here, so none of that on the last boss, so they don't actually need the hunter utility. Hunter Pad's definitely nice for that one specifically. But another thing for hunters is that they can be dwarves. They don't need to be night elves because they already have feigned death, so they don't need that night elf racial. And the fact that they are dwarves means they can actually use their dwarf racial to get rid of that fear effect as well, as you just seen happen for some of them here.
Yep, solid strat from them there. Now, of course, this dungeon pull is going to be a probably the most dangerous section of the dungeon left for Deplete from Beyond here. Of course, Matron Alma does have a significant amount more HP than everything else. So they're going to have to focus it down. But like we've talked about, Hunters have a very good job of, they do a very good job of dealing with single target versus cleave damage. Of course, they just activate Beast Cleave and then use all their single target abilities on their main target. So there's not too much of an issue here. I believe Matron Alma will probably be the first one to go down too, just with the focus damage that they have.
Yeah, so it looks like the boys actually dealt with that with one Rune Weaver and one Thorn Guard here, the one that they de-aggroed earlier, which cost them a little bit of time, but yeah, it is what they have to do to get the percentage they need. And now they're doing the same pull with the double obelisk. We see Samrek and the Tank Buster being killed by the boys, so they're also dealing with the 2 obelisks, meaning they're not going to get a time advantage from not having to deal with those. But, I mean, if you look at the percentage here for the boys, what can they really skip? Not much, right? They can skip the mini boss pull, so Matron Alma. They don't have to do that one. The one that Deplete from Beyond just did. But even without that pull, they're still going to be behind, because Deplete from Beyond, they're already in that boss area dealing with that trash.
Yeah, and it would have been interesting to see Rentari jump down and then tag Lord and Lady Waycrest to maybe, forget that it's bolstering and be like, oh no, guys, I messed up here. But that's not going to happen for a team like Deplete from Beyond. They've got it down. They're all veterans of the game. They know what they're doing in here. Just going to deal with the trash by itself and then, of course, move on to the boss afterwards. That is what the Bolstering affix does. Now, the Soul Fetish cast did get off from the Covenant Diviner here, but with everything below 20% HP, I don't think it's going to be too big of an issue for them, as everything does go down at the same time, and they're going to be able to move on to Lord and Lady Waycrest, and you can see that they have a very significant advantage at this point, as the boys is just now doing their skip to get down to the room that Deplete from Beyond has already cleared.
Yep, I mean, this time around, definitely a better performance by the boys than we saw in that shrine, but still just, having a perfect run by Deplete from Beyond, 0 deaths, not having any major mistakes, while the boys, they only have 2 deaths, but they still had to reset that pull. They had to do an extra pull to get the Thorn Guard back, and it was just a bunch of smaller mistakes adding up, while Deplete from Beyond, on the other hand, just had a clean run. And this is what we want to see from those teams, like what Deplete from Beyond is showing us here. If they want to be in the top 4 spot and actually make it to that global later on this year. And yeah, Deplete from Beyond dealing with, oh no, full team wipe by the boys. Oh, what happened?
They just died to the trash. I don't know. I mean, it could just be more of that miscommunication we were talking about. This is not a typical spot to see teams wipe to, so it could have been any number of things. Could have been a Soul Fetish getting off, could have been a Soul Volcast getting off, could have been any number of things, but the end result is the same. They were already behind in this dungeon, and that just kind of solidifies their fate at this point as well, with Lord and Lady Waycrest down to the final phase. The only thing that could save the boys would be a full team wipe on Gorak Tool from Deplete from Beyond, at some point late in the fight.
Yeah, this is definitely not good for the boys, as they also have another death here. Bob is trying to get a Masters off, but looks like someone else got incumbent. Yeah, Petco is incumbent now. Paco going down too. I'm not sure what. They're just invis potting at this point, getting past that trash, because they don't have that Shadow Melt available. Just keep past it, and there's no Awakened Portals because they didn't actually drag them all the way down. Rat's actually going in combat too, even though he did use that invis pot. So, but at least Bob managed to go through, so he'll get the Masters up. But yeah, at this point it's too little too late for them. Deplete from Beyond, they are dealing with those horrors. So once the horrors are down, it's the last percentage they need will be the Awakened mobs, and the last boss that will be between them and making it to the next round.
Yep, just gonna slowly whittle down these Gloom Hordes as they make their way down. Now they are all pretty low. If they get some Bolstering leaps off at the last second here, we could see a death, but it's not going to be a full team wipe for them. And of course the Ring of Peace at the last second there is going to stop any major damage coming out from them too. So all that stands between Deplete from Beyond and solidifying their position in our final top 4 for the final later this year, is just taking down Gorak Tool with these 2 Awakened mobs. That's all they have left to do.
Yeah, and it's easy as well, right? I mean, it's definitely not as hard as some of these other 4 Awakened mobs pull. We do have a Void Weaver, which makes it a little bit more difficult for them because they have the 3 Hunters. So higher interrupt, cooldown compared to a full melee group. But And they also need to interrupt the boss, actually. So there's actually quite a few interrupts they need to do. And this is why we see Void Weaver actually being focused by the hunters. They want to make sure they kill it as fast as possible so they don't have to use that many interrupts. Because it can definitely cause some problems if one of those casts goes through. Even if it doesn't one-shot you. But Eagle actually going down. They do have an engineering rest to use. And it's immediately being casted here by clicks. But yeah, this is what happens with Void Weaver, right? He had... Looks like he was standing in a corruption eye that got him low, and then the cast went through and it just killed him.
I mean, they weren't even focusing the mobs down. Gorak Tool's at 35% on Tyrannical by the time both of those Awakened mobs get down. This boss is getting destroyed by the Triple Hunter comp. With those Awakened mobs, it's all but over as Deplete from Beyond puts together, once again, not a perfectly clean run, but a one-death run in Waycrest Manor to take this win and secure their spot in the top 4 for our finals later in the year. That's got to be a great feeling for these guys. And also, the thing to mention as well is that Deplete from Beyond has the boys' fate in their hands moving forward.
That's right, the big win coming up for Deplete from Beyond, causing them to clinch their own global finals berth right now, as the boys are going to get dropped down and be put in an extraordinarily uncomfortable situation here, Tettles.